Good evening, everyone, and a really big welcome to you to this, our final event in the Election 2023 series, New South Wales State Election Wrap-Up with Antony Green. My name's Daniela and I'm from the Parliament's Education and Engagement team, and we're just about to get underway. It is my great pleasure now to ask the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly to officially open this event and introduce Mr. Green. And after Mr. Green's presentation, we'll have some time for some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniela. My name's Jonathan O'Dea. I'm the Speaker of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly for about another week and a bit. I didn't stand at the last election. After 16 years as a local member, I decided to retire. But the quirk of the Constitution is that the Speaker continues until the new Parliament sits, which it will do on 9th of May, and my replacement will be elected. So that perhaps just explains why I'm still the Speaker, but it is my real pleasure to be here this evening. And as we do generally at Parliament, when we hold events and when we open Parliament each day, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I also pay respects to elders past and present. We recognise our Indigenous custodians or owners, and the fact, particularly as it was the fact that our institution of Parliament that made legislation and endorsed policies that caused and continue on occasions to cause our first Australians harm and distress. And we make that acknowledgement with the belief that a more positive future will be achieved when we face and learn from our past. And in turn, that acknowledgement also reminds us of the significant powers and responsibilities that are vested in the Parliament and the government in our Westminster system. Those powers and responsibilities, of course, ultimately emanate from you, the public, the people of New South Wales. And each Member of Parliament is elected by their constituents, and in turn, it's the party or the coalition of parties with the majority of numbers that form the government. And we've, of course, just completed that very exercise with an election on March the 25th. I'm pleased that the Parliament's Education and Engagement team has conducted a series of talks on the theme of voting and democracy, which we've called the Election 2023 series. And obviously tonight we're here as part of that series. It's the fourth and final event of the series called New South Wales State Election Wrap-Up with Antony Green. And the previous three events, if you haven't already seen them, are available as recordings on the New South Wales Parliament's website, particularly the Education and Engagement part of that website. So tonight's event takes us behind the scenes of the recent state election with Antony Green, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Chief Elections Analyst. Antony's worked for the ABC since 1989. In that time, he's worked on more than 60 federal, state and territory elections and is the face of election night coverage in Australia. He's also worked on local government elections, numerous by-elections, and covered elections in the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Canada for the ABC. Antony is responsible for the content of the ABC's election website, including editorial responsibility for the site's data analysis and the ABC's election night results service. He's also adjunct professor in the School of Social and Political Science in the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. He additionally contributes a popular blog on election matters for the site, and many of you would have seen him recently on election night, guiding us through the election results, electorate by electorate. I can't think of a better person to give us a wrap-up of the New South Wales state election, then Antony Green. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
It's always odd on an occasion like this whether you should start with something completely new about the election, or in this case, what I've done is I actually went back and looked at everything I wrote about before the election and have built my comments on the result based on what I wrote beforehand, because remarkably, a lot of what I wrote beforehand worked out through the results. It was, in some senses, after a government 3 terms into power, 12 years in office, 4th Premier, difficult election, different time for an election with, rising inflation. It was a relatively obvious result that the government would lose. It was always a tough election for the government to get re-elected. But I must say, and I think I'm up to about 90 elections now, I must check that page where that's come from now. I'm going for my century before I retire. Is that it's the most amicable change of government I've ever seen in my life. It was a government that doesn't feel it's been dotted out of office. It doesn't feel, I think in 1995, the government that year felt it got so close and didn't get there, and there was a real bitterness that it only got 2 terms. This government's felt it's left a legacy, and we've seen some governments reach the end of a 4th term and lose very badly. So losing after 3 might be a blessing in disguise for recovering into the future. But to have stories of the Premier and opposition leaders meeting for 2 hours about the changeover of government, of the new Energy and Environment Minister meeting with the Environment Minister and the Energy Minister in the previous government for several hours and talking through the policies and issues. As I said, it's the most amicable change of government I've ever seen in my life, and probably speaks well of the 2 leaders, the 2 governments, and of the mood in which the election was fought, which was certainly, I can think back of some premiers earlier in my life who would barely even talk to the opposition leader. So it's a very different time in this election. On the 25th of March, New South Wales voters were given the choice of re-electing Premier Dominic Perrottet and his 12-year-old coalition government, or the opportunity to make Chris Minns the state's 47th Premier and return Labor to government. Given how many independent and minor party candidates could have been elected, there was always the chance that the electorate's decision would not be clear. There was always the chance that the election result would just be the starting point for negotiations over who would form government in the new parliament. The 2023 election was the 5th in a row where voters were passing judgment on a government led by a Premier who hadn't been there in charge 4 years earlier. Not since Bob Carr in 2003 has the New South Wales Premier survived 4 years and led their government to the polls. Since 2003, we've seen Maurice Yemmer, Barry O'Farrell, Mike Baird, Gladys Berejiklian win elections and depart within a single term. Christina Keneally came to office mid-term and lost her only election, and Nathan Rees didn't even survive long enough to lead his government to an election. Now it was the turn of Dominic Perrottet to face his first election as Premier. While only 18 months into the job as Premier, Dominic Perrottet was seeking re-election for a 3-term government. Around Australia, not many governments have lasted more than 3 terms, and those that did survive into a 4th or 5th term often came to a very unpleasant end. Under 4 premiers, the coalition had governed for 12 years, the longest period of Conservative government in New South Wales in more than a century since the stabilisation of 2-party politics. It's longer than the 11 years and 4 election victories under Premiers Askin, Lewis and Willis between 65 and 76, and longer than the 2 terms and 7 years under Nick Greiner and John Fahey between 1988 and 1995. Historically, New South Wales has been viewed as a Labor state, and extended periods of coalition government in the state is a departure from the state's political history. The first New South Wales Labor government took office in 1910, and Labor governed the state for 2/3 of the next century. That includes 52 of the 70 years between 1941 and 2011. Interestingly, I think it was Penny Sharp started to use the phrase, but she kept saying that Labor had only come to office twice since the Second World War, which was true because they'd actually been in government for 52 of the 70 years, so it's not surprising they'd only come to office for twice. the observation she also made was that those two victories had been very narrow by one seat. And it's interesting that this third victory for Labor since the war was even narrower because the government was elected in minority. I think what's more interesting than the fact that Labor won narrowly at their first election was that both of those governments, when they came to office, the Rand government in '76 and the Carr government in 1995, when those periods of Labor government came to end, it was with an extraordinary clatter and ejection for office. So both of those governments got into their fourth term, which is why I was saying sometimes there's a benefit when you lose with dignity after 3 terms. But that will depend perhaps how the new government governs and how the coalition, now in opposition, manages to recover. Because a quick look at Canberra indicates that the coalition moves into opposition in New South Wales better positioned than the coalition federally. It just hasn't had a full year to actually establish itself in opposition. So we'll see what happens. But times have changed, and Labor's ejection from office in 2011 may one day be looked back as a turning point in the state's political history. At federal elections, Victoria has replaced New South Wales as the most Labor-leading state at federal elections. And Labor has also become the natural party of government in Victoria at state elections over the last 3 decades, far cry from what Victoria used to be like. The question is whether New South Wales is going in the opposite direction, as rather than being the natural Labor state, as rather than being the industrial heart of the country, it's increasingly being a very different economy to the one it used to be 30 or 40 years ago. Has Sydney in particular become more like London or New York to Britain and the United States, the more international city? And so comparisons between Sydney and Melbourne may not be as valid as they used to be, as Sydney's structure in the Australian economy has changed and has become a more international city. Now, in the 88 years, also it's interesting to look at the way Labor has not been as successful as it used to be. In the 88 years between 1923 and 2011, there was only one Labor Party leader who never became Premier, and that was Pat Hills. 4 more names have joined that list since 2011 in John Robertson, Luke Foley, Michael Daly and Johnny Mackay. Robertson and Mackay didn't even get to lead their party to an election. Such was the disarray Labor was in after 2011. And in 2023, it was the chance of Chris Minns to determine whether he would be the new Premier or join that list of Labor members who didn't get to become Premier. Labor leaders who didn't become Premier. Labor faced a government that had been mired in poor politics rather than policy decisions over the previous year. But it could also claim a substantial record in office over its 3 terms. Not since the 1920s had there been a decade in which the face of Sydney had been so changed by the construction of new public infrastructure. The government completed or started projects that by 2030 will have add 113 kilometres and 46 metro stations to the Sydney's public transport network. Lightwell Construction, such a political sore in 2019, had now seen 2 of the promised lines up and running. Having originally been promised for Labor by the time of the Olympics, the Opal Card contract, finally let under Labor, had been implemented by the new government, tweaked and expanded under the coalition and transformed public transport use for casual users and made it easier to change transport modes than it had ever been in the past. The vast development associated with the new airport under construction in Sydney's west has also begun to change the shape of Sydney. There had also been a major expansion of the city's motorway network, though these new roads had come with a toll, pun intended. The growth of toll roads was a significant issue in 2023, given the rising cost of living issues. Yet during the campaign, neither side offered other than band-aid solutions to what would require a more fundamental relook at the design of road charging in Sydney. And perhaps it's something that will really only be sorted out once we get more down the track of electric cars and other sort of more advanced technologies. Perhaps it might come when we finally get the 3rd harbour crossing, 2nd harbour tunnel, and whether the toll arrangements have changed on that. But not all the coalition's governments are a success, of course. To list a few examples, new Manly ferries that couldn't cope with rough weather at the heads, river cats that wouldn't get under bridges with passengers on top, cracked light rail carriages, blowouts on New Country rail fleet, though whether the problems with interurban trains were a specification problem or an industrial dispute is a matter of opinion. But all this was good fodder for Labor's promise to build more trains, boats and buses in Australia. For those whose political memory extends back more into last century, the political irony of the last decade is the seed funding for all those developments has come from the privatisation of the electricity system. The Labor Party blocked former Premier Bob Carr as Premier and his Treasurer Michael Egan from doing that in the 1990s, and Maurice Yema's premiership was ended by a second attempt to try and sell the electricity assets to recycle the sunk capital into new capital works projects. So after two failed attempts by Labor and in the end a complete deadlock in the provision of new capital infrastructure in Sydney, it was the coalition that finally sold the electricity assets and determined how the proceeds would be spent. Like all governments 12 years into its office, the government had to seek re-election on its record than fading memories of its predecessors' failings. The Perrottet government remained strong on policy, but its management of day-to-day politics slipped after the departure of former Premier Gladys Berejiklian. In my opinion, the coalition would have been more favoured to win the election if the popular Berejiklian had still been at the helm. After a decade in charge of the state's senior portfolios, after a management of the COVID outbreaks, Berejiklian was across her government's full brief of policy and development issues, where Dominic Perrottet initially struggled with the shift from being a senior minister to Premier. Berejiklian's office was also a harder taskmaster with ministers, where the new Premier's office was several times caught unawares by problems in portfolios. And for a start, the political distraction of John Barilara's appointment to a New York trade office would have been avoided, which was a running sore for the government over the last year. So, how did the election unfold? To look back at 2019, it's forgotten now, but the government was under real pressure under 2019. Gladys Berejiklian was a new Premier. There had been many concerned that an unmarried female as Premier was just not electable. Memories of Julia Gillard, for instance. There were some who felt that she wasn't tough enough, didn't cope with, what's the phrase, aggression well enough. We know that New South Wales politics has always been a bit of a bear-baiting process. Gladys Berejiklian had a tough election campaign. She'd been left a number of legacy issues, local government amalgamation, the light rail that wasn't running. Some of them been hangover from Mike Baird when he was Premier. But she won the election, perhaps helped by problems, Labor Party's over-focus on the redevelopment of the football stadium. It was nice to see Chris Minns saying very nice things about it now he's Premier the other day. And also a number of misspeaks by the Labor leader in 2019. And the government was narrowly re-elected with 48 seats. Labor won 36 seats and there was an expanded 9-member crossbench. In the end, the government only had a narrow majority, and it was a majority it lost during the last term of Parliament. But the fact that the Labor Party was so far from government and there was a diverse and complex crossbench made it very difficult for there to be an alternative government in the last Parliament. The fact that COVID limited public sittings of the Parliament, in fact, also made it easier for the government to survive, that the new rules that were in place made it more difficult. By the time it came to the election, the numbers had changed. The government had lost 2 members to the crossbench and suspension. 47 seats are required to win government at the election, and the government had effectively been being a long week, the government had been effectively reduced to 46 seats, and it needed to gain a seat to get back into majority government. Labor had a notional 38 seats, and there was now a crossbench with 3 Greens and 6 Independents. There'd been a number of changes. Labor had gained Bega at a by-election. The redistribution had turned the Liberal seat of Heathcote into a marginal Labor seat. Leslie Williams had switched from the Liberals to the National Party. The 3 shooters, fishers and farmers candidates elected in 2019 had all become independents. And of course the 2 Liberals, John Sidoti in Drummoyne and Gareth Ward in Kiama, were excluded from the Liberal caucus. This set up a situation where at the election, the coalition had to hold all its own seats and potentially try and win a seat to get back into government. Assuming no changes to the crossbench, Labor needed 5 members, 5 new seats from the coalition to finish with more seats and have the first opportunity to form a minority government. Labor needed 9 seats on a uniform swing of 6.5% to reach 47 in majority government. 3 Greens which was unlikely to change, increased the chance that Labor could fall short of 47 and form government. And there was a possibility of the independents taking seats from the government. So after 12 years in government, with opinion polls indicating a swing against the government, the battle was always going to be in the coalition seats. But there were 3 seats that were worth looking at on the Labor side. The first one was, and this does amuse me in hindsight, the first was Chris Minns, whose marginal seat, 0.1%, was the lowest marginal in the state. And I know at least 2 journalists who rang me up wanting to do the story on what if Labor won the election and Chris Minns lost his seat. And I just chuckled and laughed. That wasn't going to happen. And it was nice to see, given I'd said that the seat of Cogra recorded the biggest 2-party preferred swing in the state. And Chris Minns comes out of the election with a margin of 18.3%. So sometimes you can pay too much attention to the margin in a seat. And clearly, seats along the Georges River have been moving against the Labor Party at recent elections. But Cogra, I think, had a number of specific issues to do with the Australian-Chinese vote in that election, the last election, for issues in the campaign, plus a redistribution. And I think the campaign in 2023 was changed by the fact the Liberal Party just couldn't get a candidate in the field until very late. The redistribution created 2 notional Labor seats. The party started to win Leppington in Western Sydney, which Labor easily won, and Heathcote, which became notionally Labor, but Labor started to defeat the sitting member Lee Evans, so Labor held these 3 most marginal seats. The government's most marginal seats were East Hills on 0.1% and Penrith on 0.6%. Both seats saw East Hills in particular had been Labor held for 60 years, and it was amazing the government won it for the first time. More amazing they won it a second time. Very amazing they won it a third time with a new candidate. So it wasn't surprising it fell. But both East Hills and Penrith saw amongst the smallest swings against the Liberal Party in the States. The Liberal Party did very creditably to lose narrowly in both seats. The next 3 seats taking out to 5%, which the Labor Party needed to lead, were not in Sydney. They were outside of Sydney. They were Goulburn, Upper Hunter and Tweed. My suspicion before the election was that those seats were not going to show the sort of swing we were seeing in statewide polls. There were issues which were running against the National Party last time, and I think Labor had National Party and Liberal Party had a reasonable chance of holding those seats, and they did hold them all. There was a swing against the government in Goulburn and Tweed, but a swing to them in Upper Hunter, where the government had won the seat at a by-election 2 years before. So with those 2 seats out of the way, Labor had missed 3 of the first 9 seats it needed for majority government. It then, to get up to 6.5%, which is where Parramatta and the 9 seats was met, they needed to win 4 seats in outer Sydney. Winston Hills, Holsworthy, Riverstone and Parramatta. Now 3 of those seats are in that band from Parramatta to Riverstone. They only won 2 of them. They won Riverstone and they won Parramatta, but Holsworthy and Winston Hills were both retained by the Liberal Party. So that means 5 of the 9 seats Labor needed to win under 6.5% had been retained by the government. So Labor needed to get swings beyond 6.5% to win government. So we're looking at seats beyond that. And 2 of those seats, the Liberal Party still retained. Oatley on 6%, Ryde 8.9%, they retained by 5.4%. Camden fell on 7.3% and South Coast on 10.6%. That still didn't get Labor majority government. In the end, that South Coast victory, which was well beyond what was expected, and many people expected, and Monero on 11.6% was the 7th seat, which got Labor to 45. Just a little bit of history about Monero. That's the 28th time out of the last 31 elections that Monero has been won by a party that formed government. So that's all the way back to 1927. So a century, it's got this amazing ability to go with government. And so that was, it had its margin halved at a by-election 2 years ago, but it was still a remarkable victory. Labor had to change candidate, if you remember, but bringing back Steve Wan, who'd been well known representing the seat previously, and his father had represented the federal seat going back to the Whitlam government. The family was very well known, so there was a good opportunity for Labor to win that seat, plus that symbolic thing of it being such a bellwether seat. On election night, I'm one of many people who on election night thought Labor was going to get the majority. They looked like they'd won a definite 47 and a chance in others. In the end, Labor at the end of the night, when you sat down and removed all the predictive tools, Labor had 45 seats. Definite one. And another 4 seats they were leading. and they never got beyond the 45. I've sat and done the numbers, and where at the last election Labor's vote dropped back about 0.5% overall, with the post-election voting, with the pre-polls and the postals, etc. At this election, there was a 1.5% swing back, a completely different change, 4 times the change. So the Liberal Party did much better on postals. There was no aye votes at this election. They did much better on pre-polls, and there was a much larger grouping of them, I'll explain later. There was a larger collection of people voting pre-poll. Now, this is a trend we've seen a bit recently. It happened at the 2018 Victorian election. It happened again at the 2019 federal election, but it didn't happen at 22 at the federal election or at the 2019 New South Wales election. So I've had people sort of saying, oh, you've got to look at your algorithms and you didn't take account of this, you didn't take account of that. Well, we did take account of that. It's just that it was much worse this time. So, and all you can do in terms of what I do for a living is just leave more wriggle room, leave more doubt. Now, in the fact, there was no doubt over the change of government, but it was certainly not nearly as clear that the government, I think the Victorian ride was quite remarkable. I'll also say there were twice as many pre-poll voting centres at this election as the previous one, especially in urban electorates. So instead of 1 pre-poll voting centre, you had, say, in Ryde 3, one in Eastwood, one in Epping and one in Meadowbank somewhere. And you were going, well, what's the historic vote for this area? It made it much more difficult to predict. And then the Electoral Commission only counted 1 pre-poll centre in every district. So we only got a small sample. I'll be making suggestions to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, how that can be done differently at the next election. But to me, you should count as many pre-poll votes as you can. And procedures that they used, which involved opening Legislative Council ballot boxes in pre-poll voting centres, it's just a no, you shouldn't do it. They don't do it at federal elections, and I don't think New South Wales should have done that. But anyway, that's more for something else. The government also faced a string of seats where there were independents challenging the success of so-called teal independents. Caused a lot of people to want to run at the last election, to try and sort of, really it's been an attempt to shift the Liberal Party. This was really important at the federal election. They were running on things like the Liberal Party's attitude to women, the introduction of an independent commission against corruption, about stronger climate change policies. Candidates running on those policies are always facing a problem in New South Wales because New South Wales has the strongest ICAC in the country and the government strongly supported its continuation, despite having lost 2 premiers in the last 3 years, 3 terms to it. The government has one of the strongest, state government had one of the strongest policies on climate change in the country, far in advance of the federal government. Scott Morrison wasn't the premier, which also helped. So there's a lot of that, and people had warmed to Dominic Perrottet in a way many people didn't expect 18 months earlier. So there was a number of differences, and so none of those people that you would call fitted in strongly with that teal image won at the election. Pittwater was retained, Vaucluse was retained, North Shore was retained, Manly was retained, Lane Cove, Willoughby, none of them fell. The 2 seats that did fall, Wakehurst and Wallandilly, to my mind, looks much more like something to do with internal factions of the Liberal Party about who won the seat and why there was an independent challenge in that seat. Judy Hannon did get some funding from the Climate 200 group, but she did not describe herself as a teal, and she's run before, and there are issues to do with pre-selection in the Liberal Party down there, which continues to dog the Liberal Party around the state, to be honest, and that's one thing the government the coalition, the Liberal Party has to get right in its 4 years in opposition. He sought out its pre-selection. It was a drag on the federal election, terrible problem for the federal government in New South Wales, and was a problem in the state election. Pittwater, it's a local mayor. All the independents were running in seats with a history of electing independents in state politics. So I drew a great distinction and constantly corrected people who kept bringing me up about the teals at the state election, because there were a lot more independents running who had nothing to do with the teals, and there were more of them elected than were teal independents in New South Wales. I think it's one of those issues which people have become particularly attracted to a certain type of independent, and certainly ignore the fact that in New South Wales over the last 3 decades, there is a long history of rural independence in this state, a long history of independents getting elected, and that kept being ignored at this election. Now, I've got a presentation here which is more about a few things to do with the election, which I think are worth discussing, and I think I can do broader things with comments afterwards. And the first thing I want to do is page down here, I presume. Let's go past here. Look, this is one of these trends. This is the plot of votes by type. The light yellow colouring is the votes cast on polling day in a district. At this election, only half of the votes were cast on polling day. That compares to 88% 40 years ago. And that trend has just accelerated in recent. So 50.6% of the votes were cast on polling day. And interestingly, that's where Labor did best. Labor did not do really nearly as well with the votes cast before the day. Now, the proportion of pre-polls, 32.6%. That's despite pre-poll voting being reduced from 2 weeks to 1 week at this election, but it increased from 22 to 32. So it's a huge increase in pre-poll voting. This is a trend which is not going to be reversed without upsetting voters massively. There was no I vote at this election, which took 5% of the votes at the last election. Postal voting increased to about 8.5% as a result, and there's about 6.5% taken as absent votes. In New South Wales, absent votes also includes pre-poll votes taken outside of a district. So it's a slightly different category than some other elections. But the key point I just wanted to make there was that it's interestingly, as I was talking about my prediction on the night not being very accurate, one of the reasons is Labor did much better on the day than any of the pre-polls, and it was a very different trend from previous elections in the pre-polls and postals, and there were a lot more of them, which meant those votes that come were a bigger sample and caused the shift back to the coalition in the overall vote. Now these are just, I probably should have done that, you can't read it. Labor got 30, I'll go on to the next graph actually. No, I'll go to this one. This just plots the votes since 1999. I tried to get a bigger graph, but my computer was playing up, so it's got a small one. Labor is back in the position it was in about 2007 of being 1% or 2 higher than the coalition. There has been a change in the composition of the crossbench in the 16 years since, but that huge surge to the coalition where their first preference got above 50% in 2011, and then the tack back down, that's what you would expect. That pattern of being elected to office with a big majority and then slowly trailing away makes sense. That's how governments normally form. That's what normally happens with governments. Certainly at federal level, the trend for Labor governments in New South Wales is to get elected with a narrow majority, have a big win the second time round. Happened with Neville ran in 78, Bob Carr in 1999. We'll see what happens in 2007. Just a little bit of trivia. The government has to change the date of the 2027 election because it falls in the middle of Easter. And so I think one thing I'll put to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters is they need to name the date early because they have to actually dissolve the parliament early to hold the election. So I think it should be made clear very early in this 4-year cycle when the election will be held in the spirit of what the Constitution says. This is the number of seats won since the 93-member parliament was in. 99, 2003 and 2007, Labor majority between 52 and 55 seats. Complete collapse for Labor in 2011, winning only 20 seats. And then since then, an increase to 34, then 36, and then 45. So they got back into a government minority. But the size of the crossbench, there are 12 members on the crossbench at this election. Now, that's the largest crossbench I think you've got to go back for before the Second World War to see a crossbench of that size. It's politically diverse. It holds, I think, 6 of them are Labor seats, 6 of them are coalition seats. So it's a politically diverse thing. One of the reasons the Labor Party isn't in majority is because of the 40, it has 45 seats and there's another 6 seats with an underlying Labor majority. Interesting, one of those is Kiama, which has got in two-party preferred terms 69.7% Labor vote. There's a huge exhaustion rate from Gareth Ward, and of his preferences, they seem to favour Labor rather than the Liberal Party. So it's Gareth Ward was hugely popular in that seat. You have to be popular to get re-elected given the circumstances of how he was running under when he was an independent at the election. But he had turned that seat into a strong Liberal seat, but the result in underlying two-party preferred indicates that Kiama really isn't normally a Liberal seat, and it was very much dependent on the sitting member. I'll go through this graph. This is the Labor two-party preferred at elections since 1999. Labor had a majority, 56, 56.2, 52.3 at 3 elections. Complete collapse to 35.8 in 2011. The lowest Labor two-party preferred, the biggest swing, the biggest landslide in terms of votes in any state election or federal election in Australian history until we got to Mr McGowan at the last WA election. But the New South Wales 2011 is still up there as number 2. And then the Labor recovery back to 45.7, 48. And at this election, they got 54.3% two-party preferred. Now, sometimes two-party preferred gets a bit inflated in this state because of optional preferential voting. But still, that's 2% higher than Morris Yema in 2007. And Labor won 52 seats at that election and only 45 in 2023. To some extent, that's to do with these 6 seats, which have underlying Labor majorities. And it's also down to the fact that I think the demographics of Sydney are changing. And it's harder. There's a whole bunch of seats which were once much easier for Labor to win, and they become harder for Labor to win as Sydney becomes a more international city. Some people I was working with on the election who came from Melbourne, who were doing some work on the demographics of Sydney electorates, were astonished at seats like Camden, an outer suburban seat, and the level of income levels in those seats. Property prices in Sydney sieve people by income and affluence in a way which doesn't occur in Melbourne, for instance. House prices are not so disparate. I always like to say in Melbourne, in Sydney, people ask you, where do you live and what's your view? In Melbourne, they'll ask you, where do you live and what school did you go to? It's like you can't buy a house in Melbourne which looks down on someone, but in Sydney, that's a mark of achievement. Same in Adelaide, actually, it just varies from city to city. Higher prices in Brisbane, actually, on the hills, they're above the flood level. So compare, and this is a bit hard to read, but what's the difference between 2007 and 2023? Well, so Labor didn't recover a string of seats which it held in 2007. It didn't recover Bathurst, the last of those seats west of the mountains that Labor could hold. And Labor had held it for decades, and it's now, I doubt that Labor will ever win Bathurst again, is my view, unless you bring it up into the Blue Mountains. Badgerys Creek, it's a seat which Labor has a good record held. It's been known as Mulgoa. Drummoyne, a seat which was Labor held for decades, but as property prices along the river, those factories have disappeared, been replaced by big new houses and estates. It's become much harder for Labor to win. Holsworthy, another seat that Labor would often win that seat, particularly as it currently extends to Liverpool. Miranda, well, it was Barry Collier that held that seat for Labor in 2007 and even won it at a by-election in 2013 to everyone's amazement. But it's a seat which is very, very rare for Labor to win. Oatley, a seat Labor has a good habit of winning when it has a good candidate. Mr. Green, I can't remember his first name, Mr. Green was the member for Oatley before in the last Labor government, and the loss of his personal vote and Mark Coure's work allowed the Liberals to hold it. Ryde, a traditional swing seat, was retained by the Liberals. Winston Hills, which covers a part of Sydney which changes a lot, but still the Liberals held it. In two-party preferred terms, Labor wins Kiama, but an independent holds it, as does Wollondilly. There were both Kiama and Wollondilly held by Labor in 2007. Labor did win Bega, which along with South Coast gives to the state Labor 2 South Coast seats. Seats are part of the state. It rarely used to win seats, but I think the sheer number of people retiring from Canberra is changing the demographics of those seats. Leppington, the new seat in Western Sydney, and Lismore. Janelle Saffin must be an enormous result for her, and is a credit to her work as local member and having worked so hard on the floods. It was a surprise to no one, the huge increase she got to win that seat. But you've got to go back to 1965 before Janelle Saffin to find the last time Labor won that seat. Though again, it's a seat we change in demographics, like Ballina next door. There's a much higher Green vote in that seat than there used to be, and a much higher Labor vote. Balmain is another seat that the Greens now hold that Labor would otherwise have won, along with Ballina and Newtown. But Labor did win Camden, East Hills, Monaro, Parramatta, Penrith and Riverstone. And I would say all of those seats, maybe not Camden, but certainly East Hills, Monaro, Parramatta, Penrith and Riverstone, are seats that Labor has a much longer history of winning. So I think that's an important thing to say. It's a similar looking statewide vote for Labor to 2007. It looks like they should do better, and they didn't do as well. Perhaps that's a sign of the government did have some good sitting members, good campaign. Maybe it's a sign of demographic change, particularly cities like Drummoyne that the Labor Party really struggles to win a seat like that is a sign of that change in Sydney. Now, I've gone to Legislative Council. Again, probably the numbers aren't readable. What I'll say simply is the 42 members of the upper house. Labor has 15. There are 4 Greens, an Animal Justice MP, and a legalised cannabis MP, ex-Green, in Jeremy Buckingham. So Labor and what you could call leftish parties have 21 seats. On the other side, the coalition have 15, One Nation 3, Liberal Democrats 1, Shooters, Fishers and Farmers 2. So rightish parties have 21 seats. There's a deadlock in terms of numbers. The government will almost certainly be responsible for appointing a member, almost certainly a Labor member. It would be a surprise, because the President of the Legislative Council only has a vote in the event of a tie. If the government appoints one of its members, it only has 20 on the floor as against 21 rightish members on the opposition benches, and they need to convince one of the smaller right-wing parties to support them to pass legislation. So no one in one of those small parties, Shooters, Fishers and Farmers, Liberal Democrats and One Nation, I'd be very surprised if one of them would give up their power of a vote on the floor to become the president. So the odds are that a Labor member will be appointed to the presidency of the Legislative Council, reducing Labor to 20 on the floor and meaning they need to negotiate with members on the other side to pass legislation. So the government has to negotiate in both the lower house and the upper house. But does this mean it will be an unstable government? In my opinion, no. In the same way that the previous coalition government was never at risk of losing, it's because there wasn't anything close between the two major parties. There was a large crossbench, but the chances of the opposition the crossbench combining with the opposition to defeat the government in a fixed-term parliament, where defeating government means specific procedures to bring down the government, is highly unlikely to happen. The government will have to consult and will have to deal with certain issues from time to time, but it's unlikely to be defeated. And the one other thing is something I'm particularly interested in. It's the upper house electoral system. You know how you've got the Senate nowadays and you have to number 1 to 6 in New South Wales, you need to number 1. I'll have to read the numbers, it's too small. That from 2003, when it was introduced, till 2015, more than 80% of all ballot papers in the upper house had just a 1 above the line. That's all people did. No one gave preferences. With the new system introduced in 2016 for the Senate, in 2019, the rate of 1-only voting fell to 70%, and 27.6% numbered preferences against the line. After 2 more Senate elections, the number voting 1-only fell to 58.5. The number of people who gave preferences above the line rose to 39.2. So the number of people showing preferences increased. That doesn't mean the preferences changed the result. They didn't. They had no impact on the final result. But it is good to see that the Senate system has encouraged more people in New South Wales to indicate preferences, and that's a good thing. I haven't got the information on the lower house. At this stage, it looks like more Green voters gave preferences, which was good news for Labor, but a lot fewer right of centre and independents gave preferences, which was bad news for the coalition. And that may add up to some of the inflation of Labor's two-party preferred, because in seats like Barwon and Murray and what's the other one? Barwon, Murray, Orange, where there was an independent ex-Shooter, Fisher farmer candidate, half of the voters for those parties, of those independents, gave no preferences. Half of the vote had no preferences. So there's a number of safe coalition seats where the exhausted rate is huge, and that has helped inflate Labor's two-party preferred vote. Anyway, look, I'll finish there and give the opportunity for a few questions. But that's a run-through. In the end, I don't think there was anything surprising about the result. The government had been in office for 12 years. Its best years were probably behind it. But it felt it could walk out of government with a legacy of achievement, and in one of the most good-natured changes to the government I've seen in my 30 years of covering elections. I think the voters of New South Wales have been well served by the electoral process, by the former government, and I hope they'll be well served by the new government. Thank you.
I just want to know, Antony, what is your preparation when you know an election is coming? How do you prepare, and what do you prepare, and how do you prepare?
Well, we started 2 years ago with the redistribution in New South Wales. I mean, look, it starts after the election. I've already started on the next election by starting to build a database of the results so that I have that done and ready before I get distracted by other things. So I'll have all the polling place results, preference details. I'll be preparing publications for the parliamentary research on the subject. So it starts basically as soon as this election's over. If there's a redistribution, you've got to do that at some point in the term. And then you're running up to the next election, you start chasing down candidates, so prepare the website, start getting all that stuff detailed written. And then to do the election, you've got to start talking to the Electoral Commission, make sure they're going to provide you the data you want, make sure you can get the polling place details so you can start putting in the historical data, which helps you do the predictions. So people ask me, what do I do between elections? A lot of the time it's just prepare for the next one, I can tell you.
You've just had 3 in a row or 4. I hope you get a holiday in between.
It's the 3 biggest, which is federal Victoria and New South Wales. I did get an election. I did get a holiday after the federal election. I went overseas on one of my famous bike riding trips, and I got one coming up soon in July and August. So I'm looking forward to that break. But yeah, the next 4 years are my lap of honour. I got one more for every state, leading up to what I intend to be my last big on-camera election in New South Wales in 2027. And then leave it to others to do all the hard work, and I'll go back to doing bits and pieces for the Parliamentary Library, I think.
Terrific. Thank you for that question. I think we have another one there and then a third one here.
Hi there, my name is Nish. I'm from the Inner West in Marrickville. In the federal election, I feel like it came down to mostly like the reason for the switch being women, corruption, and climate. If you had to boil down this election into 3 or 4 main themes, what would they be? Thank you.
Look, I think in the end, its time factor. I mean, its time factor didn't run as up there up front, but it was there. And the government had a bad year last year everything seemed to come back to John Barilaro. He seemed to be the only one who knew what was going on. Everyone else only saw a bit of it. And I think that is actually a sign of, I think what went wrong once Gladys Berejiklian moved on is that I think she and her staff knew everything that was going on. And I think the new Premier's office wasn't quite across of what everyone else was doing in the same way. I think some of that was a legacy of COVID. I think the standard processes of how Cabinet ran didn't work as well because of all the limitations in that period, and other matters which are part of the normal process of the government got shoved aside. I think also Gladys was, as everyone who knows it, was a process person. The process, and everything went through the process, and I think that broke down a bit. So I think on the government side, that was it. I think the fact that they'd been in office for 12 years, a couple of train breakdowns during the campaign didn't help. Cost of living, the legacy of the Morrison government. I mean, I think given the thumping the federal Liberal Party, I mean, the Albanese government didn't have a big win. The federal coalition had a bad loss. And I think given that loss, I think the state coalition did quite well to do as well it did, especially with quite a number of members retiring. Look, long-term governments get tired and the renewal process is difficult. And I think that they'd started that renewal process but hadn't gone far enough to win another election. And I think Labor had found a leader who had got the language right about being in opposition, especially in the period of COVID. I always like to point out at the last federal election that between 2019 and 2022, there were only 2 opposition leaders in office in 2019 who are still there in 22, and they were Peter Malinauskas, who's now Premier of New South Wales, and Anthony Albanese. Both of those took a much more support in the government line in the early days of COVID. A number of state opposition Liberal leaders took a position of opposing government steps, and all of them disappeared very quickly. So I think, and Chris Minns took very much the same process when he became leader, and I think that helped them. They didn't look entirely negative. And it's very difficult for an opposition to, I remember, I think the Rand government, Barry Unsworth used to call Nick Greiner, Whinger Whiner, one-line Greiner. It's very easy. Very easy to become oppositionist as an opposition leader. And I think the opposition avoided that. I think the dragging on of the transport dispute last year didn't help. So there's a whole series of things which bit cost of living, tolls, they were all there in the background. But in the end, I think it's the government had reached its natural end of life to some extent. So, and it hadn't won an unexpected previous victory. And the Morrison government was living with the legacy of surprisingly being re-elected in 2019. So I think there's a point where it was the sort of change of government you expect to see from time to time.
Thanks.
My name's Helen. I live in the seat of Rockdale. I was interested in your stats on the amount of pre-polling that occurred in this election. I'm wondering if you can account for the large increase, and do you think it's going to be sustained?
Well, the figures in New South Wales are actually quite low compared to other states. That's the first time it's been so high. It's been behind in New South Wales compared to other states. Probably would have been higher if I voted still been around. We'll see whether that comes back. It's happening in every state. It's just the issue is that once people pre-poll vote, they do it again because it's quick, easy, and it's comfortable, and it's been made easier. And people are prepared to vote. I think it's just going to be a thing that we're increasingly going to have in an election period. I think there are issues. It causes problems for the poor old Electoral Commission. There are very few polling places that take more than 2,000 votes. And given the staffing levels, it's easy to count that. If you've got to count 15,000 pre-polls, it's enormously difficult. And the Federal Electoral Commission has had the ability to count that many votes on pre-polls on election night. They have much larger organised centres where they do the counting. They have permanent returning officers with facilities and stories. The State Electoral Commission has to organise short-term facilities. They often don't have as much room for counting. And so there's a whole series of issues that make it harder for state electoral authorities. But no, I can't see the pre-poll trend reversing. Though I do encourage people, it's if you can on election day, it's much easier just to turn up and vote. But certainly the period was shortened to 1 week, and yet the numbers went up. And as the numbers go up, you've got to keep providing more centres. And the more centres you provide, the more people turn up to pre-poll vote. And people keep going on about postal votes. It's pre-poll votes that's increasing, not postal votes. And I always tell people, if you want to vote early, if you can vote pre-poll, because postal votes, there are many reasons why your vote may never be counted. Pre-poll voting is not the ideal way of voting. It's the least secure method, and it's a method where, for various reasons, you can never guarantee your vote will make the count.
Interesting, thank you. Thanks for that question.
Julian, I live in Petersham. It felt like a lot happened in the last week going up to the election day. Do you think that elections can be won in that last week, and that maybe there were a few things that happened that boosted Labor's on the day vote but not their pre-poll vote?
It's been hard to pin things down to the last week. There were things in the second last week when there were the train stuff-ups and stuff. I'm finding it a bit hard to remember back, to be honest. I mean, people started saying things to me, I think it's softening in the last week from the Liberal Party's point of view. I must say, you tend to rely on what you read in the newspapers, and I've got to say that I have never seen so many articles in newspapers with such a weird collection of seats that was totally different about what seats were going to fall. The seats that did fall were not the ones that were mentioned in most articles. There was one article in the Australian that just basically went straight up the pendulum, so I've got no idea who was telling him that, because I thought it was I just didn't think it happened. I think on the Liberal Party, you could tell which faction of the party the journalist was talking to by which seat they said was in trouble and facing an independent. The same in terms of which seats would fall. And on the other side of politics, from the Labor side, I think there were a few odd comments made, and there were some seats that just weren't mentioned. South Coast and Monera sort of dropped out of attention in the city, but I've got the suspicion the Labor Party was quite happy for having them drop out of the contention and have all the focus elsewhere.
Thank you.
Hi, Anthony. Cameron McEwen from Campbelltown region. We've seen at like a federal and a state level now that there seems to be more votes going to third parties. Is that a continuing trend that we'll see into the future? Or is that because of the change between Liberal and Labor at the moment?
I didn't get a chance to actually do this as a graph. I just ran out of time, but it's the overall two-party vote in New South Wales is about 72%. It was higher than in New South Wales at the federal election where it was under 70. That's been dropping for years, but it's been lower in New South Wales elections for longer. It hasn't been above 80% since the early 80s. But it's not the statewide vote that's important. It's the fact that the major parties have sort of disappeared in certain parts of the state, or one of them has. If you go to Western New South Wales now, you're lucky to get Labor to 20% in most seats west of the mountains. Labor was running for a number of years with the Country Labor banner. Well, the Country Labor banner was such a dud at the 2019 election, it's just been dropped. Labor just does not poll well in those seats. And there are parts of the North Shore where Labor's been replaced by Greens. At 2011, large parts of the North Shore, the Greens ran second. Now, the Labor vote has recovered from 2011, of course, but Labor just doesn't poll very well in those parts of the state. And at the same time, the coalition has disappeared in some areas, Balmain, Newtown, seats where they're distant, far away. What we're seeing is that the last election, there were 22 of the 93 seats weren't two-party contests. There were contests not between Labor and the coalition. There was one seat between a Liberal and a National, but the rest of them were Liberals or Nationals versus Independents, Nationals versus Greens, Labor versus Greens, Labor versus Independents. It's the fact that there are not dominant two parties in every seat now, which is having the impact on election results and is making my job harder on election night, I can assure you. It's not the overall state vote. Statewide two-party preferred or national two-party preferred really only made sense when every seat was a two-party preferred contest. It's not anymore, so we'll come up with a 54.3% two-party preferred for the state election. But when you take into account optional preferential voting and Labor's derisory vote in seats like Barwon and Murray, it's not really a good measure of the overall state vote anymore. It's a bit hard to come up with any single measure, but what it's actually showing is that we no longer have a single measure which measures coalitionness versus the Labourness. You can't line up all seats on that spectrum anymore. There are ultra-safe Labor seats now which are held by the Greens, and they're different. There are very safe national seats held by Conservative independents. If you go back 100 years, 120 years, you'll find that in the early formation period of New South Wales party politics, around the edges of the state, and in certain city seats, you would see independents continuing to hold on. We're seeing that emerge again. But the days when the two major parties were as dominant as they were is long gone. I do wonder, we've seen a solidification of an alternative party of the left in the Greens. What hasn't yet emerged is whether there will be a new alternative party of the right. The Liberal Democrats performed very well at this election. I mean, it's only 3.5%, but that's certainly a vote they attracted, and they may emerge as they are a more ideologically coherent party of the right than either One Nation or the United Australia Party. And so are the Liberal Democrats going to sort of emerge, and they produce much stronger flows to the Liberal Party than either United Australia or One Nation. Are they going to emerge as sort of like the Greens on the right of politics? I don't know, but trying to predict the future in years hence, I mean, who would have predicted 20 years ago that the two major parties would be not winning a majority of seats and there would be 12 members on the crossbench?
That's really fascinating, actually, and it's made me think, I wonder if there's a public program like this in looking right back at the early days of the nation and of the state and looking at voting and electorates back then, so that might be something to talk about. And I think we've got the gentleman just down here, and then I'm afraid we will have gone way over time, but sir, thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name's David from North Sydney. Antony, first of all, watching your election coverage on the ABC is a long-standing family tradition in our family, so thank you so much. I'm wondering, do you feel you're under increasing pressure with each election to make that call, Labor or Liberal, to make that call earlier and earlier in the evening? And secondly, speaking of pressure, it looks very intense from the outside. What's it like for you running that marathon? Where is your head at? What is the evening like? Thank you.
It's bungee jumping for intellectuals. You leap into the void tethered by a data stream to the Electoral Commission. Look, it is getting harder, and it's partly because politics is no longer quite as one or two-dimensional. It doesn't run from Labor to Liberal in the same way it used to. It's more multifocus. I mean, I think I tried to describe it at the federal election, like in most seats you are looking at the historical two-candidate preferred by polling place, matching the swing and calculating. Then we came to seats like Kooyong and Goldstein, where the Teals were running. You couldn't use the two-candidate preferred. It made no sense because you didn't have a historical figure after preferences for those seats. You only had a Labor-Liberal count, and that wasn't reliable. It doesn't produce a consistent swing. So we were operating off the Liberal first preference vote. And then you've got to factor in that these Teals and Independents tend not to do as well on postal votes, and they always do very badly on absent votes. And so you have to actually go back to, in America, we've always used an automated algorithm. The ABC system to automatically call seats. The Americans and other countries and Canadians use decision desks. They decide each seat manually. We've avoided that over the years because decision desks in a close election are hopeless because neither side gives up on a seat. And you sit there with saying, well, we don't know who's won. So we've always relied on this automated thing. This state election was probably its worst performance. But I think there were several factors there. One was this issue that the pre-poll vote was quite different than in the past. Another thing is that, we operate on swing, comparing polling places and calculating a swing and applying the swing to the last election. The two-party preferred by polling place varies greatly across an electorate, and it's also heavily biased, correlated with booth size. So on election night, the first figures are always from country areas, heavily anti-Labor, and you've got to correct for that, so you remove that statistical bias. Then everything else is variance. And so we've always operated in swing because it doesn't have a bias problem and the variance from booth to booth of the swing is less. But what we're getting now with pre-poll votes, pre-poll vote counting centres are larger than polling places and they may have a different pattern to the polling places and they're the last to arrive. So we've gone back to the situation where the bigger booths may have a different swing, so therefore the swing is correlated with booth size because they're coming in later. So all the reasons why we operate on swing is being undermined by the provision of pre-poll votes. So we have to go away and just add more variability or be more specific. And hopefully we get more votes counts at the next state election because that was a drag. I've got to say, in Terrigal and Ryde, and this is just a trick for young players, I'm told the Labor Party spent nothing on a postal vote campaign in Terrigal. They did really well on the day, they did reasonable on the pre-polls, and they got flogged on postals. Now, that doesn't mean postals decided it. All postal voting and pre-poll does is change when people vote. It's not like the United States, it doesn't change the turnout. It might, and the Labor Party's view with pre-poll postal voting is you just get Liberal voters voting because it tends to be older voters, less mobile, remote rural, religious minorities, lots of groups that tend to be more coalition leaning. So the Labor Party isn't always too fussed about spending a lot of money on postal vote campaigns, but it probably cost them terrible because they just did really badly. Ryde as well. Liberals did much better on postal votes in Ryde than previously. So that occurred there. I don't know whether Labor did or did not spend on postal votes. But I always say, and people sort of say postals decided it. They didn't. Everybody voted. The turnout's roughly the same as last time. Although I must say, turnout has dropped slightly over the last decade as the roll has increased. As the roll become more accurate, people who once weren't on the roll now just tend not to vote. Just one of those little oddities. So I think it is interesting. It's a lot of pressure. And as I'm 63 now, I don't think I'm going to keep doing it under that sort of pressure. But it is certainly getting tougher than it used to be because you can't rely on that one-dimensional swing the way you used to. One, it's not one-dimensional. There's other contests. And two, the change to the pre-poll voting is having a significant impact on when people vote and the change in the pattern, which isn't always reliable.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Yes, thank you.